Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mailin It, the official podcast of the United States Postal Service. I'm your host, Dale Parsan. In a recent episode of Mailin It, we talked at length about the Postal Service's incredible effort earlier this year to rapidly deliver hundreds of millions of free COVID-19 test kits in just a few short months. It was a role that people often don't see the Postal Service play, us serving as an emergency responder. That being said, the Postal Service actually has a long history of stepping up when the country needs our infrastructure and delivery resources, dating back to the mass distribution of smallpox vaccines in the early 1800s. In fact, the Postal Service is part of the federal government's official response to major natural disasters like hurricanes, wildfires, and earthquakes. In addition to delivering postal services, information, and supplies to survivors, postal workers can serve as the eyes and ears at ground zero for other agencies administering aid. To do all of that, to be a major part of an effective disaster relief effort and continue to deliver postal services to the American public, the Postal Service itself needs to make sure it's prepared to swing into action whenever and wherever we're needed. In today's episode, we're going to talk to the man responsible for making sure the Postal Service's operation around the country remains at the ready. Mike Swigart is the Postal Service's Executive Director for Continuity and Preparedness. Mike, welcome to Mailin It.
Thank you, Dale. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Let's jump into things.
All right.
Let's start by talking a little bit about you and your background. I heard that you're an engineer by training. How did you make the jump to continuity and preparedness?
How much time you got? I'm a civil engineer by education. Came out with a bachelor's degree in that in the early 90s and went directly into emergency management, although I didn't know it at the time. My first job out of school was working for a company that was contracted by the Federal Emergency Management Agency to develop or QC their flood insurance rate maps or their flood maps. I did a lot of contract work for FEMA through the years, and in 2001, came on board with Postal Service as a contractor during the anthrax attacks and helped respond to those initially. Then that work started to focus on getting the agency ready for future attacks and did contract work up till 2006. Came on full time, continued that continuity work, and then in 2010 took over the Director of National Preparedness role, and then I've been there and then in my current role since.
I'll be honest, if I had your job with what you've just explained to me, I don't think I would sleep well at night.
Sleep is where you can find it. and you learn to know when you need to sleep and when you don't, if that makes any sense.
Well, it sounds like it takes a special type of person to be able to do this work on a day-to-day basis.
The people that do this enjoy it. There's a passion for the work for sure. It's knowing that you're able to help people when they need it.
Absolutely.
Is really what it comes down to.
So when we talk about continuity at the Postal Service, what exactly does that mean?
So continuity at the Postal Service really means having the ability to continue to deliver postal services to the American public, no matter what's happening. That means we're able to collect fees, postage, we're able to process that mail, and we're able to deliver it. Number of reasons for that. One, the obvious, we're not on congressional budget, so we need that funding coming in, so it's imperative, and it just makes good business sense for us to be able to do that on a daily basis, no matter what's going on. The second is that we're legislatively or required by law to deliver universal service 6 days a week. So between the business reasons and what we're required to do by law, we got to be ready. It's a fact of life. We're 30,000 facilities large, ranging from Guam and the islands of the Pacific all the way east to Puerto Rico. So something's happening normally on a daily basis somewhere. So it's prudent for us to be ready to go. Continuity means that no matter what comes, we're able to get that delivery. We're able to get the carrier back out on the street. We're able to continue operations in a short time period and just continue on like it never happened.
There's always this sense from the American people after we have something that affects and really rocks the nation. Whenever that we see our carrier, I mean, I'm from South Florida, so hurricanes are something I grew up with. And after you've got power out for so long, after you've got, a lot of damage, trees down, whatnot, once things start to get back to normal, you can really see it by seeing, that white postal truck, that LLV driving up, and I can see my mail carrier dropping off the mail. And it does give a sense of relief that things are getting back to normal.
So for a lot of people, and if you stop and think about it, the letter carrier is very often the only visible sign that a citizen has of the federal government on a daily basis. Yes, they deal with IRS and they have to mail their tax in, but they don't see a person.
Yeah.
Right? They see that person every day, and they form a relationship with that letter carrier. So when they see that carrier back out on the street after an event like a hurricane's happened, that is the first sign that things are returning to normal, or whatever the new normal is. But it is a sign that, okay, life's moving on. We'll be okay. Let's move forward.
Yeah. So before we get too much further, I want to make sure that for the audience, we're defining disaster, that word here, because to different people, it's going to mean different things. So could you walk us through that? To you, what disaster means in this sense for continuity and preparedness?
So our focus is anything that could disrupt or has disrupted operations, but really our focus most of the time is on three big natural hazards. Hurricanes, one, because they're very broad-based. They include wind and flooding hazards, but you have warning for hurricanes. So there's a lead-up period to those where we help everybody get ready, and we refine the scope of who has to do what.
Yeah.
By virtue of some of our relationships. Earthquakes are the next biggest, and it's not that they're the next biggest. It's the next one we worry about. Not so much that you can't get ready for it, but you generally don't have any warning. So the preparedness in that effort, it's a lot like hurricanes, but you have to be ready to react once it occurs. And when it does occur, it's going to be somewhat chaotic. There'll be a lot of what we call the fog of war when you go into a disaster. You don't really know what's happening for a day or two, and then you start to assess everything and have a good idea of what's happening with postal operations, but also what's happening with civilian infrastructure around us, roads, bridges, water treatment systems, buildings, those types of things. It's you have to be able to have some plan in place or process in place so that when it does happen in the middle of the night and everybody's asleep, you get everybody up and you start to move forward with that process. The last one that we really focus on is wildfires. And that's not so much that they're large necessarily, but it's the fact that they happen very quickly. You may get a half an hour notice that you need to evacuate. You may get less than that. And again, I can give you a lot of stories on that when you're ready. Those three are the main threats that we really focus our preparedness efforts on. And then everything else we do kind of feeds out from those. Because you'll see, as you look down through the plans and processes, a lot of it is the same or very similar, even though the threat type's different. The impacts are different, but the process is very much the same.
So it sounds a lot like your team spends every day either reacting to disasters, helping the country, helping the Postal Service, but at the same time, you guys are also planning for, potential futures. So a lot of contingency planning. At what point do contingency plans, become enacted? Does it require the Postmaster General, themselves to issue a decree of saying, hey, we got to do this? Or is it mostly held within your group, your discretion, with your expertise?
All the above or none of the above.
Got it.
Okay. And when I say that, we've set up our process all the way back from 2001 to where we have emergency management teams at various levels, starting with the plants or processing centers. Then each district has an emergency management team. Each area has an emergency management team. And then at headquarters, you have obviously ELT or senior leadership, but there's also a support group that is my level, basically. It's not officer level, but it's what we call the corporate emergency management team. And they're inspection service, supply management, safety, human resources, national preparedness. They have assets and resources that the field may need when an event happens. And to get back to your question, we've set up that process so that locally, all events happen locally. And they don't happen here at headquarters, right? If you have a hurricane, it's happening on the ground in Florida or Louisiana. So the people on the ground have to know what to do when they need to do it. They can't wait for somebody to tell them to do it. Now, I'll caveat that by hurricane season, we're diligently watching the tropical forecast. And when we see areas of interest or invests, as the Hurricane Center calls them out, where they start to get a little bit more serious about how they look at it, how they model
trajectories,
yeah. We'll start to we will monitor that. And if things are looking like a potential landfall, then we'll reach out and say, okay,
Time to start getting things
time
in
to
place.
start looking at this and getting ready. And that's really one of the primary functions of our group, is that we're watching all this. I mean, we're tied in with FEMA, we're tied in with NOAA, National Weather Service. We get a feed every day from them, and we output an outlook of what I'll call it, of severe weather. It's not, hey, it's going to be 71 and sunny in your area today. It's, okay, in the Midwest, you're going to have a chance for severe storms today, right? You need to watch out for this. Or there's tornado potential in that area, the hurricane coming in, or you've got dry conditions, so the fire indexes are up, and it's those types of things. So it's a snapshot to senior leadership and to the field to say, okay, you need to pay attention to this particular threat today, or the potential for this threat today. And then it goes on. As it happens, they react to it. There's nobody telling them to react. They have to react to as it occurs.
Yeah, and we're not just talking, East Coast to West Coast. We're talking Hawaii, Alaska, Guam,
Puerto Rico.
Yeah. We're talking just, everywhere. So I would think, just from a geography perspective, we're talking so many different types of events that in some areas, predominantly in Florida, which you're going to be dealing with, are, tornadoes and hurricanes from my experience. But, it's completely different on the West Coast, where, you're predominantly going to be dealing with more fires.
And earthquakes.
And it's
right. So, and every event might be an issue in one location and not another. And the classic example of this is winter storms. The Northeast, we tell them they got a blizzard coming in. They're like, yeah, okay. What else? Georgia, you tell them they got a blizzard coming in, and it's like, oh, all right.
Gotcha.
Right. So it's not that the winter storms are that prevalent necessarily. They are disruptive, but hurricanes, you think damage. Winter storms, not so much damage. It's just it locks everything down.
Yeah.
But, so it and time zones, to your point about geography, time zones as well. Puerto Rico's an hour ahead of us. California's 3 hours behind us. Hawaii is 6 hours behind us. Guam is tomorrow plus 14 or 16. I always get it mixed up.
I'm literally counting on my fingers. I can't.
Yeah, it's so my point is that you can't have one single person telling the entire operational field, hey, you got to do something.
Yeah.
It's just, they have to know it when it's occurring, or they have a heads up that it's coming in their specific location.
So your team's spread out.
Our team is spread out across the continental U.S. I don't have anybody in the island locations anymore, but we support them.
Absolutely. So we touched a little bit before on how the Postal Service can, help out the other federal agencies, help out the larger federal government in responding to disasters. So at what point does the Postal Service officially become a part of a federal government response?
We are part of the planned federal government response now.
Oh, okay.
Right? It's how that level of activation occurs depends on the size of the disaster. So it's all based around a Stafford Act disaster with FEMA. Stafford Act means the Federal Emergency Management Agency can go in and provide funding and support to local communities or state communities. Now, that doesn't happen until states request, or local communities request the state for assistance. The states request FEMA for assistance, and then you'll hear talk about presidential declarations of disasters. That's what's happening when you hear that, is FEMA is declaring and triggering the Stafford Act. Once that gets triggered, we are part of the planned federal response with many other executive branches and agencies. Everybody has a defined role pre-event, and ours is surrounding many things, but they're all linked to our ability to deliver. Our daily operation of providing postal services to the American public is recognized as a primary mission essential function that supports the federal government's continuity plans. They have 8 national essential functions. Ours is one that supports one of those 8. So just by doing what we do every day, we're part of an emergency support. So that's one piece. Then building on that, when you have a disaster that's large enough, we'll take Harvey, for instance. You had a lot
Harvey?
of Hurricane
Harvey, sorry.
Right? You had a lot of large shelters that were opened up for these folks to go to that didn't have any other place to go. We visit those shelters generally with marketing folks to help people understand the process to do the change of address and what other services we have. We also, as part of the intake process for any shelter, change of address is part of that. We worked probably 15 years ago to get that part of the intake process. In those larger shelters, at times we've actually opened up retail operations, temporary retail operations. In addition to that, FEMA sets up what they call disaster recovery centers. And these are basically, if you can think of a trade show where you have everybody has a booth and they tell you what they do, it's kind of similar to that, where you have all the support agencies that can help individuals or survivors set up in booths, and people come in and they can, with FEMA, they can sit down and fill out the paperwork for individual assistance. We always have a booth there with folks manning it to help with change of address or other things. Small business administration, the insurance companies go in there. The reason we do that is in that scenario, the mail becomes critical for people that still don't have direct deposit, right? You get a paper check. So they're dependent on a paper check, or they're dependent upon treasury checks, Social Security payments.
Medicine.
Right? Well, medicine, prescriptions, they get mailed to them. We'll work with our customer, the major pharma companies, to make sure that those are getting into and out of the recipient's hands and not caught up somewhere in the system. So again, we're part of the response, but we're doing what we do every day.
Absolutely. So on average, how many disaster level events do you and your team respond to in a given year?
Help me out. What do you mean by disaster level?
Well, anything that would necessarily need you to break out your continuity plans, your contingency plans.
We're monitoring between 800 and 900 events every year.
What?
Some of those may turn into events where we have to break out the continuity plans, and some of them may not. For example,
oh my gosh.
The recent flash floods in Kentucky, there was a little bit of awareness going in that they had this rain system coming up through. National Weather Service was putting it out and said, hey, this may stall over this area. I can't tell you how many are going to be a contingency event necessarily, but we're engaged with that many watching, and that's across all threats, not just floods.
Again, I don't know how you sleep at night, Mike, but I'm glad you're on the case. So what are some types of emergencies that, you say 8 to 900 at any given moment, right? Or currently involved or whatnot. But 8 to 900, that's quite a lot. And frankly, I feel like if the news covered each and every one, we would be on a, 24-hour news cycle of people talking a mile a minute. So what are some of the more unique ones?
The more unique ones, tsunami for me is one that most people don't pay attention to. And when I first took over the job, we had a tsunami checklist and everybody read it and kind of laughed it off. Then we had the Japan earthquake and had the large tsunami, and everybody saw what it can do. And then all of a sudden everybody was like, whoa, okay, maybe not so much laughing.
Yeah.
We've already had 5 or 6 actual alerts for tsunamis this year based on earthquakes in the Pacific. Now, granted, they only turned out to be, half a foot of water to a foot of water in the end for us, but we still monitor that, and there's a checklist for operations who are in the Pacific or on the West Coast that, okay, if you get the tsunami alerts from your locality, here's what you need to do. And a lot of that's just, it's moved to higher ground, make sure you got things elevated, that kind of stuff. But that's one of the more unique ones. The other one is volcanoes. Prior to the eruption in Hawaii, the last volcano eruption we had in the States was with Mount St. Helens. In Hawaii in 2019, 2018 or 2019, when that erupted, your issues were, you have Kilauea, it was a big crater lake, everybody drives up and watches it. Well, all of a sudden the lake disappeared and went underground, and they had no idea where it was going to come out. Getting people out of harm's way, I won't say that's easier, but it's simpler. What we learned with that volcano is when lava hits cold water, it develops 2 things. One is poisonous gas to the human. The other one that we really learned was called Pele's hair.
Pele's hair.
Pele's hair. What happens when that lava hits salt water is it creates this glass or fiberglass substance. And it looks like fiberglass. It's very long and thin fibers that are airborne. And they can cut you. They can cause issues if you inhale them. They can cause issues with your eyes. So we had to educate as we were going through, so that the folks in the field, not just National Preparedness Safety was involved in, other stakeholders, but you had to educate all of our employees about the hazard. And it was there, and they actually put up In the units that were right there on the big island, they actually put up canopies so while they were outside, if this stuff was floating down, it wasn't coming down on them working. Then when they were out on the routes, they had to be conscious of it.
This sounds like something out of a sci-fi novel.
It is science for sure. But
it's just something I've never had to look into. That is terrifying.
We had not until that point either.
And the Postal Service tries its best to keep operating and keep things going.
Yes, sir.
My gosh. Mike, with so many people relying on email, social media for information nowadays, and even with other delivery providers in the marketplace for when they want to have things delivered, why do you think it's so important that the Postal Service specifically be involved in disaster relief efforts?
We have a universal service obligation. We go to every address 6 days a week, regardless of whether how many pieces of mail or packages we have. That alone provides stability and something standard in terms of people to get money. So we talk about the 3 M's when we're talking about our delivery after an event. It's money, it's medicine, and it's merchandise. We've talked about money a little bit with the treasury checks. We've talked about medicine with prescriptions. E-commerce is merchandise. But the fact that we're out there delivering it and we're able to do that after any event provides that first sign that things are gonna be okay. We might have a new normal, but we're gonna be okay as a community.
This may come off as a loaded question just because there's so many variables to take into account, Mike, but what's the general timeline for responding to events, for getting operations back up and running?
As we talked about earlier, it's imperative for us for 2 reasons to be back up or to be operational. One is so that we can continue to get postage in order to keep the business moving, and 2, we're required to be there 6 days a week. So there isn't really a set timeline. We're back into areas as soon as the weather clears, the water recedes, they allow us back into areas, that has a lot of damages, as soon as it is safe for us to do so. So as soon as we can get a carrier out on a street, we're doing that. Is he going to deliver to every address on that street? If there's a bridge out, no, he's not. They're going to stop at the bridge and come back, and we'll set up some other alternative method for the folks that are downstream of that bridge to come and collect their mail. If our facility is operational and is safe, we're going to be in there as soon as we can, as soon as the weather is cleared. Like for a hurricane, for example, after the hurricane has passed through, the winds die down, we're back out. Now we're assessing, and we'll work out of facilities without power if we need to for a short period of time, but we're operating wherever it's safe to do so as soon as we can.
And that also, it's one thing to have that policy or process in place, but it's another thing to be one of the employees at these locations, right? We hear from time and time again throughout the year that there's so much sense of responsibility that our employees feel about going back in. I hear it from carriers. They want to be there. They want to be helping their local community.
They do feel that responsibility. And the process you mentioned, I don't think we've touched on this, but we have a very simple process that gets applied to all of these different types of disasters, and it's called the 3 Ps. It's people, property, product, and then we hold communication. So it's people, is everybody safe? Our employees, do they know what we want them to do ahead of time, or have we accounted for them once the event happens? And that's taken very seriously. Property, we go through and look at each of our facilities. Can we operate out of it, or can we not? If we can't, where can we go to an alternate location, and what's it take to get back into that facility? And then product is, okay, where can we deliver? Where can't we deliver? Are we limited in accepting mail in one location and we move it to another location? For instance, you might move processing from one facility to another if that one facility isn't able to handle it for whatever reason. And then communications is really just telling everybody what we're doing. We telling our employees what our operating plan is, the adjusted operating plan, telling our business mailers what the adjusted plan is, telling the government, congressional, what our adjusted operational plan is.
So in the time that you've been here with the Postal Service, Mike, what, in your opinion, is the most impactful disaster level event that you've responded to, and what made it stand out so much?
It's very hard to pick one. Each has its own challenges. And I don't know that I'm going to pick one. I'm going to be a little bit resistant here, and I'll tell you why. I wasn't with the Postal Service in 9/11. That had its own challenges. That was national, right? That had the threat of shutting down the air industry, if you remember.
Yeah.
That would have been very detrimental to the Postal Service. That was one type of challenge. Let's go to Katrina in 2006. We weren't real robust with our plans, and we learned a lot, as did everybody else in Katrina. And Katrina really wasn't the hurricane that was the issue. It was the rainfall and levees failed that was like a day after, and most people don't understand that. The hurricane itself didn't cause all the damage. It was a levee failure. The next large event was Sandy, and Sandy was an issue because, quite honestly, most of the people, and not postal people, but people in general, on hearing that it was going to hit Long Island and New York City just went, no, it's not. It never hits here. So it wasn't necessarily taken all that seriously, and that in itself is a challenge because a lot of the precautionary things that could have been done may not have been done. Post that, I think 2017 was probably the watershed mark for us because you had back-to-back-to-back hurricanes and significant. You start out with Michael, and then you had Irma come in across Florida and didn't do a whole lot of damage, but it had the potential. It was a Category 5, and it looked pretty dire at one point. And then you had Maria come in and really pummeled Puerto Rico, and we learned an awful lot on that because they lost basically their power grid. If you remember, that was a big challenge for them. And the port was damaged for a couple of days, and the airport was shut down. So logistics became the challenge. Last year, Ida came through, and that's the first I've ever seen an entire metropolitan city go down without power. It took out one transmission tower along the Mississippi River by wind, and I don't think they were expecting that, and you had an entire metropolitan area plus without power. So that was the big challenge there. So I can't, just like each one has its own personality, they present their own sets of challenges. So there's not one that really stands out for me. They all do.
I can't say I'm surprised.
For different reasons.
Mike, so we're getting towards the closing out of today's episode, and I have to say just a huge thank you for you coming out and sharing with me and the audience what it is that your group does, because frankly, I had no idea, like you said, that you guys serve as kind of the silent warriors in the background, making sure that we keep our infrastructure ongoing, or that we can be back up to speed as quickly as possible and help the American people get back to their new sense of normal following a disaster. With that being said, I just want to thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Mike, it's time for Did You Know? This is a chance for us to share some interesting details about the Postal Service that most people probably don't know. Some people think of email as a thorn in the Postal Service's side, a poor substitute for the time-honored tradition of letter writing. But did you know that the post office actually offered a hybrid email and hard copy mail service 40 years ago?
I did not know that. 40 years ago.
It was actually called Electronic Computer Oriented Mail, or ECOM. And for 3.5 years in the 1980s, businesses could use it to send messages from coast to coast. You're probably wondering how or even why someone would use email to send regular mail. Well, I'll explain. Say you wanted to do a large mailing to customers or potential customers in a particular city. Instead of printing hundreds or thousands of messages and mailing them to people's homes, you would instead type your messages into a computer. Then you would send the messages via telecommunication lines to one of the 25 post offices around the country equipped to receive ECOM message traffic. Once received, the post office would print the messages, generally up to 2 pages each, insert them in special blue-trimmed ECOM envelopes, and mail the messages to their final destination as first-class mail. The Postal Service was able to guarantee delivery within 2 days. This was pretty high-tech stuff for the time. Keep in mind that when ECOM launched in 1982, not a lot of people had computers, and the internet was still a year away. To use ECOM, you had to send at least 200 messages per transmission. The message rate was 26 cents for the first page plus 5 cents if there was a second page. To put the cost into perspective, the price of a first-class stamp in 1982 was 20 cents. On top of that, you had to pay a $50 annual fee to even use the service. In 1984, 23 million ECOM messages were sent by more than 1,000 customers. Still, ECOM was controversial even before it began. Private companies and Congress worried that e-com would pose unfair competition for email services being developed by the private sector. Postal regulators questioned whether the Postal Service was undercharging for e-com and recommended drastic price increases. Facing so many headwinds, the Postal Service couldn't turn e-com into a profitable service and ended it in 1985. Well, Mike, that does it for this episode of Did You Know?
Very good.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Mailin' It. Don't forget to subscribe to Mailin' It wherever you get your podcast to make sure you don't miss the next episode. And follow along on Instagram at US Postal Service, Twitter at USPS, and on Facebook.